Native American resistance in the West. Reading materials. Instructions. Follow along with this video on your handout or by reading along on the screen. You may stop this video to annotate or to replay a certain section of the reading. Write your name and today's date on your paper. In the mid-1800s, Americans began crossing the Great Plains to spread westward. In order to protect travelers, the U.S. sent officials to make treaties with the Plains Indians. The Great Plains take up a vast area of land in the United States, as well as parts of Canada. The Plains Indians were made up of many different groups. The Apache and Comanche lived in and around Texas and Oklahoma. The Cheyenne and Arapaho lived in different regions across the Central Plains. The Pawnee lived in parts of Nebraska, and to the north lived the Sioux. These groups each had their own language, but were able to communicate through a common sign language and a basic understanding of each other's lifestyle and culture. Plains Indians and their culture depended on two animals for survival, the horse and the buffalo. Plains Indians began using horses in the 1500s when the Spanish brought them over from Europe. Plains Indians learned to ride these horses and hunt on horseback with bows and arrows. This allowed them to hunt the buffalo year-round and shape their way of life. The buffalo were an integral part of Plains Indians' lives. The Plains Indians used all parts of the buffalo for their daily needs. Nothing was wasted. Buffalo hides, bones, horns, and organs were all used for some purpose in the lives of the Plains Indians. As more settlers continued to move west, their desire for Native American land increased. The U.S. government made treaties like the Treaty of Fort Laramie to avoid disputes or arguments. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was the first major treaty between the U.S. government and the Plains Indians. A similar treaty was also signed 2 years later in 1853. Both treaties show that the U.S. acknowledged Plains Indians' hold over most of the land in the Great Plains. The treaties, however, also gave the United States permission to build forts and roads across the Indian homeland, as well as permitted people to travel across them. In these treaties, the United States promised to pay for any damages to Indian lands. The treaties did not last long. In 1858, gold was discovered in present-day Colorado, which brought thousands of people west. These miners soon clashed with the Arapaho and Cheyenne. In 1861, the U.S. government negotiated new treaties with the Plains Indians. These new treaties created reservations for Native Americans. The government wanted the Native Americans to stay on the land set aside for them, the reservations, but this made hunting the buffalo almost impossible. Pioneers and miners continued to travel across the Great Plains. In order to protect them, the U.S. government built forts along a popular trail, the Bozeman Trail. This trail and the subsequent forts were on part of a very important piece of Sioux land, their hunting grounds. The Sioux reacted to this invasion of their land with war. In 1866, Chief Crazy Horse and a group of Sioux ambushed and killed 81 cavalry troops, soldiers on horseback. In 1868, the U.S. government made the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which promised to close the Bozeman Trail, have the Army abandon the forts, and give reservation land to the Sioux. While the U.S. government attempted or tried to negotiate with Plains Indians in the north, they also tried to negotiate with Plains Indians from the south. In 1867, most Southern Plains Indians agreed to live on reservations with the signing of the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. However, these Indians also did not want to give up their hunting grounds. Fighting broke out between the Comanche, Plains Indians, and the Texans, Americans. The U.S. Army and the Texas Rangers were not able to defeat the Comanche, so they cut off the Comanche access to food and water. In 1875, the last of the Comanche leaders surrendered. The Plains Indians continued to fight back against being confined to reservations. The U.S. government sent troops into the area to force the Indians to leave. As fighting on the southern plains came to an end, new trouble started in the north. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's soldiers found gold in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. Sitting Bull, a leader of the Lakota Sioux, protested American demands for the land. Other Sioux leaders refused to give up their land. Fighting soon broke out between the Army and the Sioux. On June 25, 1876, scouts from Custer's troops found a Sioux camp along the Little Bighorn River. Custer led 264 soldiers through the Montana Territory against Sitting Bull's band. In the battle that became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, or the Battle of the Greasy Grass as the Native Americans called it, Sioux forces led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse surrounded and defeated Custer and his troops. It was the worst defeat the U.S. Army suffered in the West. It was also the last major victory of the Sioux. Sitting Bull led his people to Canada in 1877, but they returned when they ran out of food in the hard winter of 1881. They eventually joined the Sioux on Standing Rock Reservation in Dakota Territory. Indian Service agents worked on reservations and in Indian Territory to monitor the assimilation of Native Americans to the American way of life. In 1890, Indian agent James McLaughlin ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull out of fear that he and a group of religious Indians called ghost dancers were going to flee the reservation. The Indian police shot and killed Sitting Bull. As a result, many Sioux left the reservation in protest. The ghost dance was a religious movement in which the followers believed that the American invaders would disappear from native lands, the ancestors would lead them to good hunting grounds, and the buffalo herds would return in abundance. After Sitting Bull's death, many Hunkpapa Sioux fled to join Chief Spotted Elk. This group of Native Americans was on their way to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation to meet up with Red Cloud, a prominent Lakota leader. On December 28, 1890, as the Lakota led by Spotted Elk were making their journey to the reservation, they were met by the U.S. Army, who surrounded them and ordered them to make camp by Wounded Knee Creek. The Army set up 4 large automatic weapons around the Lakota camp in preparation for the next day. Early in the morning on December 29th, the Army leader demanded the Lakota hand over their weapons and board a train to take them to the reservation. Most weapons were confiscated from the Indians, but fighting erupted. There are differing accounts as to how the massacre began, but according to some accounts, it started with a scuffle between 1 to 2 Native Americans and some soldiers, and in others, it began with some Native Americans beginning to ghost dance. Either way, American forces began firing on the mostly unarmed Lakota men, women, and children. In less than an hour, at least 150 Lakota were killed and 50 wounded. This became known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. In the Southwest, the Navajo who lived in present-day Arizona and New Mexico refused to move onto reservations. U.S. troops raided, attacked, destroyed, and stole from Navajo fields, homes, and livestock. The Navajo began surrendering when they ran out of food and shelter. In 1864, the U.S. Army led the Navajo captives on a 300-mile march across the desert to a reservation in New Mexico. In the far west, the United States promised the Nez Perce, a peaceful tribe in Oregon, that they could keep their land. However, within a few years, the government ordered the Nez Perce to a reservation in what is now Idaho. Some of the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, attempted to escape to Canada. Near the border, the U.S. Army captured them and forced them onto a reservation in Oklahoma. By the 1880s, most Native Americans had stopped fighting. The Apache of the Southwest, led by Geronimo, continued to battle the U.S. Army, evading capture. They eventually surrendered in 1886, ending Apache resistance.